Mr. Chairman, we began discussion about House Bill 1256 last week, and so I am thankful for the opportunity to bring back before you a few additional points. I really sat and listened and really took in the conversation that the committee had with regard to House Bill 761 about the preclearance and the fact that actions have been taken as recent as 2019 that could have needed to go under preclearance. That, you know, around the conversation of the plus or minus 5%, we heard that the Voting Rights Act is so important, and even we heard a delegate say that the Voting Rights Act could actually be gutted. It may not be reauthorized because it's been authorized on partisan votes, and in 1902 the Virginia Constitution disenfranchised a whole race, and Section 5 was that safeguard. And because it was gutted, that's why there was a bill like 761. And so that was one of the main concerns that some of my colleagues and I have about the amendment, cross-referencing the Voting Rights Act as it is today. But a lot of us know that there are signals that this Voting Rights Act would not last as it is today in the near future. And so wanting to get to a better amendment with all of the host of reasons that I said before last week, that is what was the impetus to get to House Bill 1256. And so it has some differences. It has this similarities has the same selection process and committee structure. It has been amended to include that as the proposed constitutional amendment. But some of the conversation that we started to have, if you look at what was handed out, some significant concerns about, based on just hypotheticals, but based on the timeline that is allowed in the amendment, and based on previously what we've seen from the Department of Elections and kind of the time that they need to get ready. It shows you the different reiterations of when we would need a map in order to not cut into early voting and in order to not cut down on the primary season.
So if I can move it along just a little bit,
Sure.
The bottom line of this bill is this is an alternative to the constitutional amendment about redistricting. It basically creates an independent redistricting commission to draw lines and advise the General Assembly. There are some differences, but it's basically the same thing that's in the constitutional amendment. It's just put in statute.
And Mr. Chairman, I would just give one small adjustment to what you said. Okay. I don't believe that we should be using the term independent when we're talking about any of the proposals that are before us, because there are legislative members on there, and it's also bipartisan. There isn't even room for independence at the table. So I would say that it is a legislative fix with a bipartisan makeup.
So the makeup of the membership is basically the same that's in the constitutional amendment.
Yes.
8 legislators and 8 people that are chosen by judges. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Does everybody understand what's in this bill? I mean, it's been before us for a while. Have you looked at it? Does anybody have any questions of Senate Delegate Price? Senator McClellan.
Yes, Mr. Chair. Just based on a conversation that Meg and I had, I think there's a little bit of confusion about whether this commission can function regardless of whether a constitutional amendment passes. So my question for the patron is, if the constitutional amendment passes and we have this commission, would this commission just be advising the independent commission set up by the constitutional amendment? In other words, are they in conflict or not?
Mr. Chair, Senator McClellan, if this piece of legislation passed, HB 1256, and then the constitutional amendment was also passed by the General Assembly and then approved by the voters, they would be in conflict. There are provisions in this bill that would not be constitutional under the constitutional amendment.
Okay. Mr. Chair, may I ask a clarifying question for what we just heard from council? So is it that one could exist and be superseded by, or that they could not exist because the other one does not start? The time frame for the elections results to be certified is several months after what 1256 would begin, where that would begin. So there is some period that they would not be in conflict. Is that correct?
That would be correct, but then as soon as the amendment was adopted by the voters, and so the Constitution was amended, there would be provisions of this bill that would no longer be constitutional. As it stands right now, if this bill were adopted and the constitutional amendment did not get passed by the General Assembly or approved by the voters, then it is not unconstitutional, but it does not work with the constitutional amendment.
So, Mr. Chair, I asked Meg to prepare an amendment. I think there's a little bit of confusion about how this interplays with the constitutional amendment. And I know a decision down the hall has not been made yet on the constitutional amendment. I think this has merit, but whether this passes, whether this takes effect may be contingent on what happens down the hall. So based on that, I have an amendment I would like to move just to keep this conversation going.
And the amendment would basically require the constitutional amendment to pass for this to be effective, or would require it to pass the legislature for this to be effective?
Well, I asked for one, and Meg wrote another one based on, I think, how she thought they worked together. So what I wanted to do was, my understanding is whether the constitutional amendment passes or not, there could be an independent body that begins collecting data, talking to the public, getting public input on how the district should look, could draw maps that then could be given to the independent commission created by the constitutional amendment, if that passes, for their consideration or not. Or if the constitutional amendment doesn't pass, could be given to the General Assembly for their consideration or not. And so what I wanted to do was to say that this bill would take effect July 1, but to continue the conversation, say contingent on the constitutional amendment passing the General Assembly. I mean, as a practical matter, this is probably putting it in conference, but yeah.
Meg, I take it from your look of consternation, that's not exactly what you have drawn up.
It's not.
No, Mr. Chairman, my understanding from what was communicated was that it just needed to be contingent on passage of the amendment by the voters. I did not realize that.
The way I heard Senator McClellan's motion, it would have to be contingent on the passage of the constitutional amendment from this legislature.
Right, so
And it would take effect July 1. And the beauty is you'd have somebody looking at this, getting ready for whatever the constitutional amendment for that panel.
I would say, though, that if this bill is supposed to operate in conjunction with a constitutional amendment, there would need to be additional changes made because this bill would be in conflict with the constitutional amendment should it take effect.
What I would suggest is if we can adopt this amendment, we're going to have to send this bill to the Finance Committee, and we can work on additional.
Janet's thrilled.
We can work on additional changes between now and then.
Great.
Chairman,
Senator Spruill.
could she tell me what other new changes be made in order for this thing to work?
If, Mr. Chairman, Senator Spruill, if this bill is supposed to operate in conjunction with the constitutional amendment, there are provisions related to how the bills will, or the maps that are adopted by this commission and then provided to the General Assembly, that language would be in conflict with what's in the constitutional amendment. The fact that we have a different timeline set out in this bill versus the constitutional amendment, that would also be an issue. So there would be some things that would need to be tweaked. And then this bill ends up looking pretty similar to SB 203 and HB 758.
Okay, but the constitutional amendment that we have is over in the House waiting on something now. So what would happen if we would put that same on this bill? We would have to do all that then, if that's the case. The one that's in the House that they have on hold right now, what happens if we put that constitutional amendment on this bill?
I don't think we can put that constitutional amendment on this bill, Senator Spruill.
Okay.
I think, that has to be a resolution, which we've already passed.
Okay.
And let us say, and we've done what we could do.
Okay.
Now it's on you, it's in your body. So is that amendment pretty much that the bill will take effect July 1, but it's contingent on the passage of this General Assembly of the constitutional amendment? Is that what you want to do? How you?
Yeah, so what I'm trying to do is put it in conference. And so if that's the amendment, we need to put it in the conference, then yes.
Okay, and is that the
Second.
amendment you seconded?
Second.
Yes, sir. Okay. Does everybody understand the amendment? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, we've got that amendment.
And Mr. Chair, may I ask a question?
Senator
Just for
Vogel.
purposes of clarification, Meg will be able to make that change as an amendment to the prior bills where we added that amendment, correct?
What
To be
I'm
consistent?
hopeful that Meg, between now and the time the bill comes up in finance, Meg can figure out what changes are needed to make the bill consistent with the constitutional amendment.
Mr. Chairman,
Senator
I
Spruill.
understand, but you got the patron here. I mean, she at least know what we're doing. We're gonna sit upstairs. She didn't know what we can do to her bill.
Mr. Chair, let me try. Sorry,
Senator
since I started
McClellan.
this. Here's what I want to do, and unfortunately, I don't have the amendment now to do it.
Okay.
My understanding of this bill is whether the constitutional, or at least the patron's intent, and she can, let me ask the patron. Your intent is whether the constitutional amendment passes or not, there would be an independent commission created by your bill that could begin work on July 1. Is that right?
That is how some of us have come to an agreement on the merits of the bill.
And based on what Meg said, currently, that is not the form that this bill is in, but that's the form we want it to be in. So how about this? I think what we want is an amendment in concept that we can flesh out in finance. Maybe it's parts of the bill only take effect, depending on what happens with the constitutional amendment. But I think what we're trying to do is have.
Mr. Chair, Senator McClellan, if the intent is simply to get this bill to conference, any amendment will do. We can just change any word, then when it gets over to the House, Delegate Price can reject it. I think the issue is that this bill was drafted to not have to have a constitutional amendment passed by the General Assembly or adopted by the voters. It was meant, as I understood it, meant to operate completely independent of a constitutional amendment instead of a constitutional amendment.
Well, and I guess here's the problem we're in. And maybe the patron can help me decide which way she would prefer. The Senate as a body has already taken a position on the constitutional amendment. I don't think a majority of the Senate is going to want to take a contrary view. But I do think a majority of the Senate thinks that the independent commission you've set up and the people on it and the work that they can do is valuable work that should happen no matter who is drawing the lines ultimately. So I think what we're trying to do is have a substitute that allows an independent commission to begin work on July 1st, whether a constitutional amendment passes or not.
So I would like to be able to address that. So, Mr. Chairman and Senator McClellan, I definitely appreciate the latitude that you all were willing to go to in order to continue this conversation. I think where I will have to exhibit some political courage is to actually ask that you not make that amendment to be fully transparent. There are fatal flaws with the amendment, and this was an attempt for us to be able to, with House Bill 1255 and 1256, say, we've got 2021 covered. Let's get to a better amendment that includes lots of the amazing parts of the enabling legislation that we came up with in a small work group that would allow for the language of the Voting Rights Act to be in there, that we could handle some of the timing issues that could put into question the integrity of our election and a lot of the other things that we talked about. So my concern is now asking council to do something that would end up not being constitutional. Should it pass?
I'm interested in trying to get the bill out of here, and it won't get out of here unless it has that clause on
Then
it.
I'm going to shut up.
Okay. The calls, I think we've already agreed to that amendment. And I would entertain a motion to report and re-refer to finance.
Mr. Chairman,
I'm sorry, Senator Howe.
I don't think, finance has not asked for this, has it?
It has,
Oh, it
yes.
has, okay, then, okay.
I mean, if you're telling me.
The point that I want to make is finance is not a place to make a policy decision. It's a place to decide if you're going to fund it.
So why are we
So
sending,
if
why are we
we're
sending to
being-
finance then?
Because it does have a financial.
There's
talking about
1.5 million
policy.
over 2 years for whichever option our General Assembly decides.
There's money attached because it's going to require work. That's why.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not talking about that
Senator
part,
Sproul.
Jen. I'm talking about as far as the policy part of it. The money part, I can understand. I'm not talking, that needs to go to finance. I'm talking about that. But if we send it where it is now without it being clear, that means they got to do the policy as well, the finance part. of it.
They're not going to do policy, Senator Sproul. My thinking is that as long as we can keep this alive, we can keep people talking about it
Yes, sir.
and maybe find a way to get this passed.
Mr. Chairman, move to report and refer.
Second.
Okay? We've got a motion to report and refer to finance, re-refer to finance. Any further motions, any more discussion? If not, open the roll. Okay, thank you, Delegate.
Thank you.